So hello and welcome to our Kipaipai Friday night happy hour. And tonight we have a presentation by Betty Ann Brown. Actually, I'm super excited because Betty's given us actually quite a few presentations, but this one is so unique. And it also is addressing an exhibition that is currently up at Launch Gallery that she curated. And so we'll actually be, looking at things that are relevant to an exhibition that's actually up right now. So you'll have an opportunity after the presentation at some point during the span of the exhibition at launch to actually go see the show. So this is really a unique presentation. But anyway, I'm going to let her talk about it, and I'll let you share your screen, Betty, and then we'll get this going. And welcome, Betty Ann Brown.
Thank you, Andy.
Oh, and everyone, if you will please mute yourself too. That will be helpful. Thank you.
It says that you guys can see it. Can you?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So good evening. It is great to be back here. Andy said rightfully that I have done several presentations for Kipaipai. I guess I like it. And I am so committed to Kipaipai as a community and as a group of artists and as a support system that I'm really glad to be able to bring my interests and my experiences to share with you and hopefully enhance your world of creativity. So tonight I want to talk about several things that circle around this idea that art communicates what is important. As you see, I titled the talk, "To Depict is to Value." And the exhibition I'm going to focus on is called Configured Landscapes. It's at Launch Gallery until, I did not write this into the PowerPoint, but the show closes on October 2nd. So I'm going to talk about 4 ideas here. I'm going to talk about briefly, I'm going to introduce you to the curatorial process. I did a whole PowerPoint on how to be a curator, and I just thought I'd talk you through how this happened at launch. Then I'm going to use as an art historical example the Venetian Renaissance artist Paolo Veronese to talk about what I mean about depicting cultural values. I'm going to briefly outline some of the arguments about art as a form of visual communication, and then I'm going to look at configured landscapes as a case study, engaging all these ideas. I am not talking about all the artworks in Launch Gallery right now. Indeed, I am not talking about all of the artists. We try to keep these Kipaipai talks down to less than an hour. And so I had to be choosy. I said I'd start out by talking about the curatorial process. And I worked on this exhibition with the director and curator of Launch Gallery, who is a guy named James Panozzo. And James is in this photograph, second from the right. He's the only one who has no black on. I guess his tie is kind of black. It's gray, really. But I like this photograph because it has so many Kipaipai people there, not just our beloved Andy, but also the 2 artists who were having a show at Launch, Joy, Ray, and Samuel. And we all, of course, know these 2 lovely artists from Kipaipai as well. So this is how the exhibition started. Well, before COVID, I did lots and lots of studio visits with artists. Now that COVID is here, I do that much less, but I look at a lot of art, even if since COVID, I've had to mostly look at it online. And I began to realize that there were a lot of artists that I considered interesting artists who were dealing with the landscape in really innovative ways. So I jotted down a couple of possible artists who are doing that and contacted James and said, hey, how about a show about, new ways of looking at the landscape? And he's like, that's great, but your list is almost all white people. And James is a not-for-profit gallery that is supported by, among many other supporters, by the city of LA. And they are very insistent on diversity. And I said, you know what? I completely agree with that. And I went back out and found a whole different group of artists, or a mostly different group of artists. And the show is so much stronger because of working with James and negotiating the need for a lot of diversity. And I just have to give him a big thank you for making that clear and thereby making the show a lot stronger. Anybody who is in our business sees different artists all the time and sees different kinds of artworks all the time. And I keep in my mind this list of artists, but the truth is there's so many wonderful artists here in Southern California that it really helps to talk to artists about other connections to be made. And it really helps to talk with people like James to shape the curatorial process. So when James and I first started talking, he was suggesting that we do the show next January. And I contacted 12 artists, and they all were real excited about doing this show at launch in January. And then James said, no, wait, we've got an opening. How about September? And 2 of the artists had to drop out because they had other commitments in September. But 10 artists stayed with the group. And I'm going to talk about most of them today. So what am I saying? The curatorial process. You have an idea, you share it with somebody, you get feedback, you consider a venue, and then you share the idea and the artist with the venue, and you get feedback from them too. It's always a negotiation, a give and take, and it's very malleable. That's the curatorial process for this project. The second thing I want to do is talk to you about the idea of art as visual communication. And I am using here random, I just picked it, a Venetian Renaissance artist named Paolo Veronese. He is a very well-known Venetian artist, and he has created some immense, like 20 feet across, 15 feet tall, are paintings, many of which have an ostensibly religious subject. So here is a painting. We're going to get a little closer into this corner down here. But this is the whole painting. It's called The Marriage Feast at Cana. And it was done in 1563, as you see there. At the marriage at Cana, the book of John reports that Jesus performed his first miracle. He got to the wedding and pretty soon they ran out of wine. So the story goes that Mary, the Virgin Mary, his mother, said to him, Jesus, you got to do something, we're out of wine. So he told the servants to come forward and fill jugs with water. And here are 2 of the stone jugs that they had filled with water. And then Jesus did his thing and transformed the water into wine. So as you can see, while this servant is pouring the wine, out the jug into the smaller vessel, you can see it's been turned into wine. So this is a story out of the Bible, a story that every member of the intended audience would know very well. Just like everybody who's listening to me knows who Mickey Mouse is, knows who Mickey Mouse's girlfriend is. Mickey Mouse is part of our cultural mythology. The Bible was the book of stories for the Renaissance, and it inspired huge amounts of paintings. And in this case, it inspired Veronese. So Veronese was, as I said, from Venice. And in the 16th century, when he was painting, Italy was not a unified country. It was many, many, many. It was an aggregate of many, many, many different countries. The Pope had dominion of this purple area. Here's Florence, and here is the Republic of Venice. And I brought in this map just to point out that Venice, the Republic of Venice, stretched all the way down here, where it was adjacent to the Ottoman Empire. And I'm sure you all know that during the Renaissance, the Ottoman Empire was an Islamic state. And they did constant trade with Venice, which is one reason Venice, as the threshold between Europe and the East, was so welcoming to Islamic peoples. I'm telling you all of that because as we get closer into that corner I pointed out, you will see that 1, 2, 3, 4 of the men have on turbans. These should be read as members of the Ottoman Empire. And between the 3 of them, you see not 1, but 2, and here's a 3rd, Venetian beauties. Venice was known for its beautiful women with strawberry blonde hair. And you see them ornately decked out at this dinner. I'm not so interested in those people. What appeals to me, and the reason I picked Veronese, is because in addition to the wealthy, powerful people who are seated at the feast, we see a Native American man identified by his feathers. We see an African child, but they were very, very rarely depicted. The Renaissance world, and I'm going to just jump out of order here, mostly portrayed the rich and powerful, which meant mostly, almost exclusively portrayed Christian, white, wealthy individuals. So when Veronese puts these non-central, non-privileged people, the Native American, the African, and the little person, right there into his paintings, he is challenging the status quo. Almost everybody else who painted a dinner party with Jesus included only white people. But Veronese has a more expansive view. This is another immense Veronese painting of a dinner party. And he was hired to do this in the city of Venice as a Last Supper painting, as a Last Supper. And he included, as he had done at that previous painting, little people and an African servant. He also included dogs. Well, the Holy Inquisition was not happy. In 1573, he was called before the Holy Inquisition to explain his inclusion of people and animals that were considered not only devalued, but heretical. To the point, what I'm trying to say is that the Catholic Church actually considered it sinful to put these people into this painting. And the way Veronese responded changed the history of art. He claimed what we today call artistic license. He said, we painters take the same liberties as poets and madmen. The Inquisition didn't care about what he said, and they ordered him to repaint the whole painting. And he didn't do that. He just changed the title from the Last Supper, excuse the typo there, to the Feast in the House of Levi. I'm saying here that Veronese was transgressing the social norms of depicting only the valued individuals of the society when he did things like include this little person here and this African person here. The dominant culture wanted art to be limited to the wealthy and powerful, and Veronese violated those social norms. Europe was, at the time he was painting, a slave-based society, and there are very, very few depictions of slaves in the art. People whose bodies were outside the norm were not valued either. They were generally portrayed without respect, like clowns or buffoons. Instead, as I anticipated, the Renaissance welcomed images of the rich and powerful, like Raphael's painting of Baldassare Castiglione, who was not just a diplomat, but also an author, who was best known for his book on Renaissance manners called The Courtier. So this is high society telling people how to behave. Another Venetian Renaissance artist was Titian, and he did this portrait of Pope Paul III and his grandsons. I hope that as soon as I said that, some of you were like, what? How can that be? Well, throughout the Renaissance and Baroque eras, the popes were not necessarily men of integrity. Pope Paul III had children with numerous women, and those women had children, and two of them are seen here. Pope Paul gave a cardinal position to one of his grandsons and a military position to the other. This hypocrisy by the leader of a church that mandated celibacy for its priests gives you an idea of the ethical problems of what art portrayed and how and why it portrayed them. I should tell you about this guy though, real quickly. He wasn't all bad, even if he was a blatant hypocrite. He commissioned Michelangelo's Last Judgment, one of the most important paintings of the Renaissance. And he also was the Pope who declared that the indigenous people of the Americas were fully human, and they had souls, and they deserved humane treatment as they were being forcibly converted to Christianity. So he made sure that Catholic countries did not enact the widespread slaughter of indigenous people in the Americas that, for example, England did. But even as he is acknowledging the humanity of the indigenous people of the Americas, Paul III also said, but we're still going to have slaves because, you know, that's the way it works here. Another portrayal of the rich and powerful. So not every artist maintained that strict decorum that the Holy Inquisition tried to impose on Paulo Veronese. By the time we get to the Baroque, the Spanish master Diego Velazquez began to depict the full humanity of little people and slaves, as we can see in two of his astonishing portraits here. By the way, the slave, Juan de Pareja, was given to Velazquez, and Velazquez gave him his freedom, and he also taught him how to paint so that Juan de Pareja could have support himself. So he became an artist in his own right after having been freed from his status as a slave. So all of this to say If we look back at the history of art in Western Europe, and we look at the Renaissance and Baroque, for example, we will see that what the artist portrayed was not just what the society in general valued, but what the institutions of the society, like the Catholic Church and its penalizing arm of the Holy Inquisition, mandated that artists do. It was considered heresy to do what Velazquez has done in these two portraits. And I have to say, as a feminist, that although we do have those portraits of little people and slaves that are rare, but sometimes valuing them, it is really rare to see women of color honored during the Renaissance and Baroque. This is one of the few, perhaps the only, Renaissance Baroque painting that gives agency and presence to a woman of color. It's attributed to Annibale Carracci, although we're not 100% sure that he did it. And it's a portrait of an African-American woman holding a clock. Scholars believe she was probably a seamstress, and we've got the pins here indicating her profession, and then she's standing next to someone who's got really fancy clothes on. And she's holding a gold clock. Mechanical clocks were really developed in the Renaissance. So she's not only holding something gold, but also something newly valuable. So throughout time, art has focused on what is valuable. And that means the people who were valued by the society, as well as the stories that were like the stories out of the Bible that were honored by that society. So how do we take that to a broader impact? Well, first of all, I have to clarify that art does not have to be narrative in the way that Paolo Veronese's paintings depict stories, that is, narratives from the Bible. Nor does it have to be narrative in the way Velazquez portrays devalued members of his society with respect. Art does not have to be narrative to communicate. Abstract art communicates as well. As our beloved Georgia O'Keeffe said, I found I could say things with color and shape that I couldn't say in any other way. Things I had not words for. And then the philosopher Martin Foss adds, expression in the field of art is always communication. To get real basic and biological about it, all organisms survive because they can communicate to their own and other species. They have to be able to communicate to their own species in the way trees communicate with each other, and they have to be able to communicate with other species. Art is a form of communication. It's one of our species' most basic and important forms of communication. So the question is, what is this art saying? To answer that, we have to translate the visual communication of art into verbal communication, into words. And there will always be a gap of difference between something that is visual and something that is verbal. Just as, for example, and we've all experienced this, when you take a book and translate it into film from one medium to another, there's always a gap. It's not the same. Whatever I say about art will not be the same as what the art itself is saying. There's a gap, but we do the best we can. So visual communication is only one form of communication. Human beings communicate 4 ways, and we all do this on a daily basis. The first is verbal. Obviously, I am communicating verbally with you right now. The second is nonverbal, which means communication that doesn't take the form of words, like body language. The third form of communication is written, And the fourth, and the one we're focusing on, is visual. Artists work in visual communication. They create images and objects in order to communicate with viewers. Their goal being to stimulate feelings, religious faith, curiosity, interest, identification with a group, memories, and or other thoughts. If artists are communicating, there has to be somebody to receive that communication. So it takes both the artist and the viewer to make a piece of art function. The artist must convey an emotion, an idea, whatever, and the spectator or viewer must receive it. But in order for this reception to happen, the artist and the viewer must share a common fund of experience. We all know what Walt Disney was communicating with this, because we have grown up in a Disney saturated world. But images like this often baffle us because we don't share the common fund of experience that this Mesopotamian artist worked from. Similarly, a man from Mesopotamia, maybe the guy who did this image of Inanna, the goddess, maybe certainly he would have no idea what this was. Recognizing this, as we all do here, happens because we have a common fund of experience. We don't share this fund of experience, so we have to get educated to be able to understand what the visual communication is. If we share that common fund of experience, art connects us. Art connects us. But in doing so, art plays a dual, a two-part, and a somewhat conflicting role. On one hand, art is a statement of individuality, the product of a single mind. I should say usually a statement of individuality, usually the product of a single mind. Obviously, people collaborate and then there are multiple minds. On the other hand, however, art is a statement of the common bonds between all humans, and it serves to create a sense of community, of something greater than that, just that one mind. That creation of a sense of community through sharing the artistic experience is what we're going to talk about today. When you feel that sense of community, because you've looked at an artwork and you share the common bond of experience with the artist and you get what they're doing, you have a sense of what is called resonance, what can be called resonance. When we see an artwork that we really get, we resonate, we vibrate with it. It's like a musical chord struck in us. I'm calling it resonance here, but I could just as well refer to it as the aura of the artwork. And I remind those of you who have heard some of my past conversations about Walter Benjamin's concept of the aura, which you can only have when you see the artwork in person. Sadly, you're not seeing any of this artwork in person tonight, but I hope that you will. In conclusion, the making of art remains a part, but the viewing makes it a shared experience. I'm sure most of you know the German photographer Thomas Struth, who has done a huge and amazing series of photographs of viewers looking at art. These two women here and here are looking at Gustave Cailbat's Paris Street, A Rainy Day. He's a French impressionist, and this is from 1877. I'm going to get back to this idea of community at the very end today. But first, let's look at some of these artworks that are created by artists. In this case, all of the artworks are individually created, and with which I resonate really strongly and from which I feel a sense of community. So that is taking us to our fourth and final topic today, the exhibition at Launch Galleries, Configured Landscapes. Many of these artworks are pointing to the lush abundance and infinite variety of nature. But others also point to different meanings in the landscape. Mark Stephen Greenfield's pieces portray cotton fields picked by African slaves. Other artworks point to sacred places, sacred landscapes, Hung Viet Nguyen. And yet others focus on a world threatened by flooding and other outcomes of the global warming, which we are all experiencing to such a horrific degree this year. I'm speaking here about B.B. Davidson's paintings that we'll look at in a minute. In the end, I would say that most, all of the paintings in Configured Landscape communicate that nature is beautiful and good, that nature should be valued and saved. And by extension, that we humans must come together to build community around valuing nature. So what I'd like to do is look at Configured Landscapes, artist by artist. I'm going to go semi-alphabetical. No, I'm not actually. But I am starting with the first artist in the alphabetical list, Dina Caparelli there. So these are the 8 artists who ended up in Configured Landscapes. And here is a general view of the gallery. Again, thanks and grateful acknowledgement to James Spinoza, the gallery director. And here is a second view. That's the main door of the gallery. You come in, there's a front room, a smaller room back here, and then that's where James' offices are. So the first artist I said I'd talk about is Dina Caparelli. Dina is a painter's painter. And I've thrown in a few details here, but I almost took them out this afternoon because it's not the details so much as the conglomeration of details and the contrast between various passages in her paintings that make these works so beautiful. They range from very specific, almost like botanical illustration details to abstract passages that are just about the glory of paint. So some of them look like manicured formal gardens when you first look at them. And then as you look a little bit closer, you'll see that, this is not really specific paints. It's a lush, impastoed, painted passage. I love the use of color and the pairing of these pale pink denuded trees with the bright pink, very LA sky. This is another that has that sense of a manicured garden and the juxtaposition of very precise iris, for sure, recognizable botanicals to, again, wild abstractions. The trees are cut into these conical shapes that are echoed by this strange black, what is it, sculpture, presence. Again, a manicured garden with juxtaposed with lush abstraction. Notice how you're led into the several layer upon layer upon layer of landscape imagery. So here's one of the details, cherry blossoms. And here's a close-up of those pale pink trees. Look at how the sky becomes this wonderful black and gray abstraction, and how this becomes a pyramidal presence. The second artist I want to talk to you about is Patsy Cox. She's a ceramic artist, and she does tiny little ceramic pieces that she puts together, and they become aggregates. She thinks of these as related to the flow of urban life and the nature that is contained and restrained and exploding out of the urban environment. So each of these is a separate piece that she installed around this window-like opening between the front main room of Launch Gallery and the smaller back room. And then you can see how they frame that opening. So cool. And then in front of that opening on a pedestal are 3 more of her aggregate pieces, obviously in primary colors. And I know you can't really make this out very well in this photograph, but can you see that this is a mouth with teeth? Here's a mouth, here's a mouth. So they begin to take on almost humanoid characteristics, even as they are plant-based and abstracted. So these are the 3 Patsy Coxes I just showed you. And behind them, on the far wall of the front main room, is this exquisite painting by Hiroko Yoshimoto. Hiroko, well, when James and I were talking about an exhibition in January, and I had 12 artists on the docks, I went to, James told me that if I'm going to do 12 artists, he doesn't want anybody to have just one artwork in the show. And so they have to have multiple artworks. And because of that, they would have to be small. So that's how we went forward. And then he changed the time, and it ended up only being 8 artists in the show. And suddenly we had a lot more room. So when I did a studio visit with Hiroko, and by the way, Hiroko has perhaps the single most amazing private home I've ever been in, with the most seriously most exquisite view I've ever seen. It looks out over Ventura, out to the water, and it is just mind-boggling. I would like to move in and just live there and never move, because all I want to do is look out the window. Anyway, she was working on this painting when we did the studio visit. And I fell in love with it at the time, even if she said she wasn't sure it was finished. So when we ended up having only 8 artists in the show, I knew I would have more space. And I called her up and I said, you know, that really gorgeous painting that I just fell in love with when I did the studio visit, will you just throw that in the car and bring it down? I can't promise you we'll have room for it, but please. And she did. And although James had gotten worried about all the art that was arriving, to the point where he called me up and said, Betty, I don't think there's going to be room for everything. In the end, there was plenty of room, and we got to include this gorgeous painting by Hiroko. So I just am crazy about this. And I'm crazy about it for several reasons, not the least of which is it is an homage to the beauty of the landscape, but it is also an abstract painting and very expressive. I love the sense of color. I love that it seems natural, and yet it's also abstract. I love how positive and affirmative it is. And if you get a little closer, you can see the intriguing way that Hiroko abstracts from nature. Indeed, this particular detail reminded me so much of some of the details in C.J. Gillick's ceramics. If I had known C.J. Gillick's work when I was curating this show, I didn't see it until after the show had been installed. If I had known her work, I would have put her in the show too. She's just breathtakingly gifted as a ceramic artist. But see all those like little stamen there? They made me think of what Hiroko has done here. So I think it's interesting that there is an intriguing parallel there. More by Hiroko. This is one of her smaller pieces. And speaking of smaller pieces, Hung Viet Nguyen, when we were still thinking we'd have so many artists and all the pieces had to be quite so small, I picked 3 of these from his series of sacred landscapes. So this is, of course, Patsy Cox down here, and these 1, 2, 3 are by Hung. And this, by the way, is a photograph by Samuel, because I didn't actually photograph this wall by itself. So I just bagged one of her photos off Facebook. Thank you, Sam. Anyway, these are small abstractions from the landscape that are sacred images, and they all have these boulders that almost seem like sculptures. That have been brought down into the landscape, kind of like the monolith in 2001. The thing about Hung's work is that once you get close to it, the surface is endlessly fascinating. He uses really thick, sensual impasto that sometimes looks almost like a Van Gogh painting, and builds these surfaces so that they are like sculptures, a relief sculpture on a canvas or a panel. Look at those textures. It's just astonishing. Gagam Kacharian is another artist in configured landscapes. And when I did a studio visit with him, we were still thinking that the works had to be pretty small, which breaks my heart since he generally works quite large, and I would have loved to put some of his large works in. But I had to have this one. Those of you who know me know that I am particularly fond of felines. And can you guys make out the cat here? Cat eyes, cat nose and mouth, cat ears with tufts on the end. Can you guys see that? So these are painted on mylar, and you cannot tell in the photograph, but they have this glow, this sheen. And Gagam often juxtaposes 2 really different styles of painting. The cat itself is fairly naturalistic, and then it's laid over with all this explosion of abstract forms that take on the presence of something beyond the visible, something beyond the tangible, the presence of another entity or another realm or another atmosphere. So there's always this juxtaposition that creates this tension and animates these to the point where they're just really dynamic. Oh, I love them. And oh, I wish I could have had a big one for this show. This is a close-up of the second piece by Gagam. And I think here you can see the background of geometric forms overlaid by the lacy, exuberance of color and form. Wow, what a painter. Here are some naturalistic kangaroos, again juxtaposed with those dynamic blurbs and blobs and spirals and whoa. Bibi Davidson, I'm sure you all know her work. One of my favorite artists in LA, often creates work around her alter ego, a figure that looks like the idea of Bibi at least. And she has lately been very concerned about environmental issues. And here she portrays a young woman who is about to drown in a flood. I don't know if you guys can tell in the photograph, but these blue dots are actually objects that attach to the surface of the painting. So they do have dimension, and they make the surface really dynamic and tense. And you begin to get the water as a swirl, sucking her down. Look at the quality of paint. Look at just the way the water goes over her lower lip and chin. So beautiful. Look at what is she looking at that's frightened her so much. And the second B.B. Davidson piece in the show is this tree, which is also getting flooded. It is not a specific tree. It is an imaginary plant, just like her woman is an imaginary presence. It's totally out of her head, and yet it stands for all trees suffering in the cataclysmic, apocalyptic climate change that we are all experiencing. So Mark Stephen Greenfield is obviously known to all of you. And I selected for the show this piece, which is a cotton field. All those white areas can be read as cotton balls. And of course, the reference to cotton evokes slavery and the slaves who were compelled to pick the cotton. Mark creates all of these images by hand. There is no digital manipulation. He is a meditator, and he goes into the zone and allows his subconscious, activated by the meditation, to direct his hand to create these marks, which are breathtaking when you see them in detail. And there you go. I can't believe that he does these things by hand. No sketching, no computer assisting, painted on the flat white surface. And here is the second Mark Stephen Greenfield in the exhibition. And of course, there is yet another reference to race with the watermelon. And it appears in this immense field of Mark's graphic gestures. So I think I've gotten in, yeah, just barely under an hour. I want to repeat what I'd said before. These artworks point to the lush abundance and infinite variety of nature, although some, of course, have very specific meanings. But in the end, all of them communicate that nature is beautiful and good, and nature should be valued and saved. They also urge us to come together and build community around valuing nature. If I were asked what would be my ultimate goal as a curator, it would be to bring people together to build community around valuing nature. And I just thought I would point out that I'm by no means the only person who links building community with valuing the earth. Because the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at one point said, "Join with the earth and each other to bring new life to the land, to restore the waters, to refresh the air, to renew the forests, to care for the plants, to protect the creatures, to celebrate the seas, to rejoice in the sunlight, to sing the song of the stars, to recall our destiny, to renew our spirits, to reinvigorate our bodies, to create the human community, to promote justice and peace, to love our children and love one another, to join together as many and diverse expressions of one loving mystery, for the healing of the earth and the renewal of all life." That makes me cry to read that. I think that is the most beautiful affirmation of what we should be doing as human beings right now. God bless Martin Luther King for saying that. And is with that heartfelt quotation that I end. Thank you for your attention. I really appreciate you all signing on. And it's been my honor to be able to talk about this great art. The formal presentation is over now, but I'm wondering if anybody has questions or comments.
I'm looking at the chat real quick here. Let's see and see if there's any questions. I think it's just a lot of like, way to go, Betty, and thank you. And but I don't see any questions. But if anybody has a question, let's do you want to unshare your screen, and then that way we can see everybody's faces. And if you have a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself. And
whoa, sorry.
Anybody?
Okay, there we are.
Okay.
Any questions or comments?
No?
Well, again, I thank you so much for your attention. And Andy, thank you for that, the opportunity to do this. Obviously, I love doing it. And I just want to urge all of you to take Martin Luther King's words to heart, because that man was blessed and a blessing to us. And God knows right now in this world, we need to use our art to build community. So thank you.
For sure. Thank you, Betty, so much. Once again, an amazing presentation. And this recording will be posted on the kipaipai.com website, also on the Kipaipai Workshops YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again, or you want to share it with someone, we'll be posting that link shortly, probably tomorrow morning. And anyway, thank you all tonight, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Have a
Bye-bye.
good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Betty.
Thank you, Betty. Thanks so
Thank you,
much.
Mart. And thank you, Andy. Thank you, Andy.